Bloomberg television anchor Manas Krani and his panelists, Minister of International Cooperation of the Arab Republic of Egypt, Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, and Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities of Denmark, Dan Jørgensen.
Welcome. Good to see you. Good to see both of you. The last time I saw this minister, she was corralling 700 or 800 people in Cairo at a conference. But it's great to see you both. Listening to John there setting the agenda for our panel, which is, I suppose, what's the first takeaway from Glasgow last week? We have an app which all of you can join in and ask questions of both the ministers. It is Dr. Rania Al-Mashat and, of course, Dan Jørgensen, Minister for Climate and Energy in Denmark, and Minister Rania, she is the Minister for International Cooperation. So you listen to the language that John used. He used the word furious. Some people were furious about the outcome from Glasgow. Minister Rania, are you furious about the outcome, or is that too strong?
No, I think furious is a strong word. I think expectations or anchoring expectations is a better word to use in this circumstance. But let me just give a little bit of background. What we've seen since the pandemic is an acceleration in the rhetoric around climate action, and that's a good thing. Today, governments know what they want. Private sector is more aligned. And multilateral development banks or the international community are all talking green. The issue is, how do you take that talk into operational, actionable, on-the-ground events that can actually help with the targets that have been set in Glasgow?
Minister, let me bring it to you. When I caught up with you earlier, you said, Manas, remember the phrase, keeping 1.5 alive. You were in the room. Dr. Rania, you were also there as well. You were in the room when some of the final crunch moments came. Your conclusion on 1.5 being kept alive, is it a strong life, or is it one on life support, sir?
Well, you can barely hear the pulse, but it is alive. Now, you might say, how can you be satisfied with that? And in a sense, I'm not. I think everybody wished that we could have done more, and that we should have done more, not this year, but 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that we're in a situation now where if we had not made the decision that was made in Glasgow, it's fair to say that the chances would have been gone. I mean, if we didn't decide, which we did, to revisit the NDCs from the different countries, that is the pledges on how much they will reduce next year, if we hadn't decided that, then they wouldn't have been revisited until 2025. And by the way, that would have then been with the aim of reducing after 2030. And the scientists tells us that we need to act within this decade. So that's why the decision was so important.
Well, that's why political will is incredibly important. I want to ask a poll of the audience and join in. We'll continue our conversation. We'll put it up to the audience. The 1.5 degrees Celsius target for the Paris Accord, is that still possible? The pulse is barely alive. That's the top line from the Danish minister as we stand at the moment. I'm going to get the EM response in just a moment from Dr. Rania. But here are your choices. It's your poll, vote now. Is the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Accord still possible? Yes. Yes, we can do it. And COP26 showed the path forward. No. We're going to shoot through 2 degrees. That goes to the pulse is barely alive. And COP26 fell short. And C, you can get 1 second, and 3, prepare for 3 degrees. We're doomed. I don't know which one you're going to vote for. Vote now. We'll get the results. Your quick response?
Well, I just want to say one thing. That you used that question, that headline, shows you what we got out of Glasgow, because actually the Paris Accord doesn't say 1.5. It says well below 2, aiming at 1.5. But because the language is so strong on 1.5 in Glasgow, that is what we're basically aiming at now, which is a great progress.
Okay, that's perhaps a more ambitious call, you say, than what was in Paris. Let's have the poll results, and then we'll get a quick response to that as you press. Oh, here we go. No, we're going to shoot through 2 degrees. COP26 fell short. Well, let's talk about where it fell short, Dr. Rania. We're coming in. Yes, we can do it, and COP26 showed the path forward. You've got a busy year next year at Al-Mashat. No pressure. We're going to shoot through 2 degrees. COP26 fell short. My conclusion from talking to you is it's going to fall short on the financing. That's perhaps what you are most anxious about?
Yeah, so basically in order to move forward and achieve the targets, we need the fuel, and that fuel is the money. What we find is that emerging markets and developing markets really are the places where more needs to be done in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and so forth. But these are the countries that don't have the financing. And when we take a look at what was pledged, it's very important. But at the same time, how do you make sure that this money reaches the developing countries and is able to move? And let me give an example. Many of the countries that need the financing are not really rated B, they are B or less. And therefore, it becomes very risky for capital to go in and invest in these projects. So here comes the idea of de-risking with multinational development banks, concessional lending, trying to help accelerate or reach the 1.5 degree. So there's a, if we say there are many stakeholders, every stakeholder has certain items and elements and actions that they have to work on so that we are able to reach the ambition of the 1.5 degrees.
So developed market, emerging market, you're both here. This is the message. There's a financing gap. Dr. Rania, are the developed markets being arrogant in their expectation, or do they need to do more to close that financing gap?
I think there are pledges out there.
Yep.
The issue is, how do I take this and actually bring it down on the ground so that we are able to move together? I believe that, and this was a disappointment in Glasgow, the idea of the damage, stop damage, the loss and damage, and that the emerging markets were asking for that, but the US and Europe said no, there will not be any money for stop and damage, but loss and damage, but there will be technical assistance from the UN. That's great, but it does not help fulfill the aspirations of these countries as well as in terms of the global agenda. So what we need to do is, something else that faces emerging markets, adaptation projects are extremely important, but adaptation projects do not generate money. So they're not very attractive for the private sector. They need a lot of investment from the government side. Yeah. And with countries coming out of COVID, out of the pandemic with a lot of debt,
yes,
this is something else that we have to really think through and find innovative ways of financing that can help the emerging markets, but at the same time push the global agenda.
How do you say, Dan, that we close that gap? Where is the innovation? How do you do that? How do you deliver on the demands to EM?
Well, depends which gap we're talking about. I mean, there's what I call the small gap, which is the one that was discussed the most in Glasgow, which is how do we deliver the $100 billion
yes,
a year from 20 to 25 that was promised to the developing world. I mean, it's embarrassing that we haven't delivered that yet. Also because that is actually only the small money, because we know we need trillions.
Well, the UN says you need 140. That gap is short by 140, but it's trillions. Why has it failed? Why have those pledges not been delivered?
Well, the most obvious reason is that governments around the world haven't been willing to pay up, so to speak. That's one part of the explanation. A different part of the explanation is a little bit more complicated, and that is, I think you referred to that also. It has to do with the fact that there are actually a lot of money out there that could potentially be invested. A lot of institutional investors, pension funds and others actually want to invest in green transformation. But because a lot of the countries that need the money don't have the political and economical infrastructure to receive this money, to make it a secure investment, that's not happening. So the de-risking, capacity building, all of these issues need to be center and forefront of the discussions from now until next year.
So let me take that to you, because you and I have caught up on a number of times about multilateralism, various agencies that you've worked with. How do you see Egypt working on crowding in? How do you see emerging markets stepping forward? I mean, the two have got to meet in the middle, don't they, between DM and EM?
So let me give an example of Egypt. So when I say different stakeholders have different actions that they need to do, governments need to provide a policy framework. In our case, we dismantled fuel subsidies, which were there for many, many years.
Yes.
There's an integrated sustainable energy strategy that says we're not using coal for electricity generation. And by year 2022, 20% is going to be renewable. And by year 2040, 60% of our energy mix is going to be renewable. So policy is very, very important. Then comes the idea of multinational development banks.
Yeah.
You look on the website of any of these institutions and you find many facilities, a climate initiation facility, an integrated coal facility, etc. World Bank has many facilities, EBRD has many facilities. The idea is what we need to do between now and maybe COP27 is to try and create complementarity, a clear framework for the international community to be able to take the pledges and actually show them in projects on the ground. Capacity building is not a simple thing. Let me give you an example. We were the first country in the Middle East to issue a green bond. Okay, this was in September 2020, and this is something big. But the idea is the investors that have invested in this green bond are waiting to see the impact of the projects that they invested in. This requires huge undertaking in terms of capacity in the different ministries. And we are advanced. So imagine other countries that are not at that level, that have not had their strategies put in place. You need a lot of investment in capacity building. So we have this pace issue. Everybody wants very quickly to go to the 1.5 or to make sure that we reach the 1.5, but there are realities on the ground which have to be addressed.
But part of this is about assessing risk, and this is about government assessment of emerging market risk. This is about bank and credit divisions around the world assessing risk on the ground.
Well, not only assessing it, you also need somebody that wants to carry that risk.
Well, let's talk about that. Sorry, go ahead, Rania.
And so here comes the idea of the concessional lending, right? There's the concessional element that comes into blended finance so that you can de-risk the private sector money or the capital as it comes into countries. And that's what we need to work on. And that's where these pledges have to come. And that's where we need a framework where we say MDBs that are able to provide that concessional finance can do that, and we look for the bankable projects to be able to translate these targets have to be translated on the ground. They have to be. So we want to go beyond the numbers into what we see on the ground. And the final thing, look at how many numbers were put around. The financing gap, it's a small one, it's a big one. There's another SDG gap by 2030. So there are many gaps that are out there. We need to have a clear data quantification.
But I want to pursue further the idea. You said, well, who has to carry that risk? This morning, Stephanie Flanders was with me just on the television a short time ago, and she said one of the nuances that came out from the discussion this morning is about more government in a variety of ways in a post-pandemic world. Yes. That's what we've learned. So the question is this then, is big government, DM government, G20 government, whatever G you'd like to choose, doing enough to carry the risk? Is it government responsibility or is it bank responsibility?
Well, it's a combination, but to answer your first question, no, I don't think governments are doing enough. I think definitely there are a huge potential to make a real difference if you take some of the money that countries are now actually deciding to spend in climate aid.
Yes.
And use them maybe not only to subsidize, establishing offshore wind or whatever, but also looking at the financial models. Well, I think that we've maybe looked at this in the way that you would look at development policy in the past and not recognizing that this is a totally different type of policy, and what you need might be a little bit different from what you've done in previous years. Okay,
let me fly a kite then. Who's got the power to change this narrative, really to change this narrative from blah, blah, blah to rob somebody else, to actually change it from that to a deployment of capital that bears the risk? Is it China and the United States of America? I know that there's an incremental move forward here. Is it up to them? Are they the power brokers to shift the risk element? You're nodding your head.
I'm just saying that it's everybody's responsibility. Everybody has a role to play. So
but I'm just looking for who can ignite that backstop more.
I think COP26 started it, and I think remember it was 2 years until Glasgow. So there was a pandemic. Today we only have 12 months to Sharm el-Sheikh. What was discussed is still fresh, and we need to maybe push forward as much as possible. But everyone has a role.
Okay.
But it's just important to underline that this is not something that rich countries should do because they are idealists and to help poorer countries. Not only, at least. Primarily, it's because it's also going to be very good business. I mean, a lot of renewables, take offshore wind as an example, can actually now compete with coal in price most places on the planet. And if you look into a future where India, for instance, they have now pledged that they will establish 500 gigawatt of renewables before 2030. Today they have 0 gigawatt of offshore wind. So there's a huge potential, and it's a business model for many countries. My own certainly, but I would assume many countries are looking into this right now.
The other theme we managed to snatch just a few minutes, all of us here and there through this morning, was monitoring. So Dan, let me come to you on that. Many pledges, much ambition. The United Nations has limited capacity to chastise people who do not hit their targets, who do not deliver on their pledges. How important is a more robust monitoring framework? Where does that come from? Who does that? Who should take responsibility for that?
Well, I do actually think that that's one of the areas where some progress was made. New rules on transparency and monitoring, which most experts actually said nice things about, so that's a step forward. Also, if you look at the market-based instruments, the carbon market, what's called the Article 6 in the negotiations, there we have now established new rules that will secure environmental integrity, for instance, in the sense that we will avoid double accounting, things like that. But there is an underlying problem to all of this, which is that the COP process in the United Nations doesn't make legally binding regulation in the countries that have signed the treaty. That's simply not possible. We don't have a way of sanctioning countries that doesn't fulfill the criteria. Having said that, if there wasn't any consequences of breaking the rules, then I don't think we would have as fierce negotiations as we have. The reason why countries are really engaged in this and why it matters is that there is naming and shaming, and countries are watching each other. And I don't think you'll get away with pledging something and then don't delivering on it. Dr. Rani.
I just want to say that in terms of sanctions, I mean the whole principle in Paris Agreement is shared but differentiated responsibility, right? And therefore it is on every country to decide given its development. But something else is happening. We have ESG, which is coming up. We have, under Mark Carney, many stress tests for banks based on how much they do when it comes to green projects. So there is already a momentum when it comes to the green recovery, when it comes to a private sector looking for green projects that generate money, renewables. We had a deficit in electricity. They were exporting electricity because we were able to create many solar projects and actually the energy strategy that I was talking about. So I think that it's not about sanctions, it's about, I think, a global movement towards climate action. Everybody's more aware. The amount of times the word green comes up in conversations, whether it's policy, whether it's national goals, national strategies today have to include green. Otherwise, you won't be able to draw investments, you won't be able to finance your deficit, and you won't be able to show your commitment to this international movement towards climate action.
We've 1:20 left, so I'm going to squeeze 2 in. To you, Dan, question from the audience very quickly. Why don't regulators and countries underwrite the first losses in green financing, in EMs? Is that something, and why don't regulators and countries, sovereigns, underwrite the first losses in green financing in emerging markets with a sub-investment grade rating? Is that a kite that could be considered to fly?
Well, I think the question is, why don't they? Well, that's difficult for me to answer why different countries don't, but I think probably that is a way forward, and I would assume that that's definitely for my own country and in many European countries, that are some of the possibilities that we're looking into. I think that probably one of the reasons it hasn't happened before is, coming back to what I said earlier, that we are still thinking about climate aid as we would traditionally look at development aid.
So we need to progress our thinking. Dr. Rania, you have 20 seconds top of the agenda on the way to Sharm el-Sheikh.
Yeah, Sharm el-Sheikh is going to be very important for us, but it's on the climate. I just want to say that Egypt provides a very significant example when it comes to development finance, ODA. We have a portfolio of more than $30 billion. 50% of that contributes to SDG number 13 with mitigation and adaptation projects. And there is a lot that we can do when it comes to South-South cooperation. Sharm el-Sheikh is a COP for Africa, and therefore we say United Africa for a resilient future. And there's plenty that we're going to be discussing in the next 12 months to try and create an integrated global framework for this financing. We need to have MDBs in there. We need to find innovative ways to accelerate the blended and to accelerate the de-risking.
I hope many in the audience are there. I hope I'm part of that conversation alongside you in preparedness for that event next year. Dan Jørgensen, Minister of Climate and Energy and Utilities for Denmark. Thank you very much. Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation for Egypt. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.